Hello, everybody, and welcome to MZ Webinars. We are very excited to be joined today by MZ's Executive VP of Global Operations, Andy Derman, the boss, in other words, and VP of Innovation, Duncan Brown. We basically call them the dynamic duo, especially when it comes to data. Anyway, if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll endeavour to get back to those at the end of the presentation. And we will be sharing the recording and slides from today in a follow-up email, so make sure you keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I will hand over to you, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. Appreciate the intro, and hello from a very sunny Basingstoke today. Always sunny in Basingstoke for anyone that knows this area very well. So thanks again for joining us in the third webinar in our Levelling Up series. And I once again have Duncan joining me so we can pore over some exciting labour market data. Hello, Duncan.
Hello, Andy. Thank you. It's always exciting and dynamic where we're involved, I feel.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll lock you back in your cupboard now. We'll let you out. But thank you very much for your contribution today and joining me today. So for those of you that are regular viewers, watchers, welcome back. Thank you. Hope you're finding this series on the Levelling Up agenda of interest. It's certainly something that we're very exercised by. For those of you who are new or have not been fully indoctrinated into the doctrine of MZ Burning Glass, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. You know, as a business, our mission is very much in helping regions to thrive through understanding what's driving their local economy and how that can feed into key stakeholder engagement, decision making, right the way through education, economic development organizations and employers, and ultimately to help individuals, whether they be young people aspiring for careers or existing workers looking at their next steps, to really understand what's driving opportunity in their area so they can navigate through a very complex and ever-changing world of the labor market. And our vision as a business is really to be the global leader in labour market information, and particularly with a focus on the future of work and certainly the way the labour market's working ever more so at that skill and capability level. So hopefully we can illuminate some of that as we go through today's session. So welcome and thanks for joining us. As mentioned, we've been on a levelling up journey here on the MZ Burning Glass UK webinar series. We kicked that off, Duncan and I, a couple of months back, I think it was now, where we sort of did a bit of an intro session, and we'll be revisiting that. That was followed by our sector leader colleagues who were diving into the specifics in terms of what the levelling up agenda means from different viewpoints in education and economic development. And today we are circling back into the topic of skills and how skills play within the levelling up agenda. But more generally in this series of webinars, plus various other bits and pieces that are coming through, we obviously want to reflect on the pertinent points from the recent white paper on the topic that's fueling a lot of this thinking. Our goal certainly is to dive into data around the labour market to see if we can sort of illuminate aspects that you might then be able to take forward and think about for your own local areas as we think about what reacting to and driving forward the levelling up agenda looks like for you and your work. And really obviously keen to showcase how we can be supportive of that activity and point you towards various resources, not just the content of these webinars, but other things that are available to you as well. So that's the journey we are on today. You may recall from the first webinar that Duncan and I gave on this topic, we really circled on the fact that the heart of this matter is skills, really thinking about what skills are being sought within localities and how that might drive productivity, but also what talent is available or being produced in the region. And as I say, you know, that's very much front and center of what we're all about as a business and what we're thinking on, and particularly starting to try and get to the nuts and bolts of what's driving opportunity and how that opportunity might be harnessed under the banner of the levelling up agenda, but actually more generally across all the work that educators, economic developers, and businesses are thinking about as they think about the world of work, talent, and the economy. So we're going to start off, Duncan, by a bit of a recap, I think, of where we sort of left the first webinar. And we were looking in really at the high-skilled end of the labour market, as that's identified as a particular driver. So we're going to do a bit of a recap, but with some slightly updated data and a slightly different viewpoint before we maybe start to try and dive into the details that are driving these headline trends that we shared last time. So I'm going to invite you back out of your cupboard now and to join us and to really sort of talk about where we left off and before we dive a little deeper.
So last time around we used what is quite a simple kind of reductionist sort of measure of looking at different parts of England in terms of whether the share of people that they've got who are highly educated, so typically with some higher education, level 4 and 5 and above. And then on the other hand, the share of jobs that in an area that are high skilled. So that's kind of managers, professionals and technical type jobs. And it's a simplification because, of course, there's a lot of other parts of the economy that can also be quite important, a lot of other parts of education that can also be important. But I think once you start to see it, it's quite a useful frame to think about in terms of leveling up, because here we have the two metrics mapped here. So on the left hand side we have the share of adults in each of these regions, which are similar to travel to work areas that have some higher education, as I say, level 4, 5 and above essentially. And then on the right hand side we have the share of jobs in those high skilled categories. And what you can see is that there's a degree of correlation there, where you have this kind of hub in London with some spokes coming off it, which across both the education levels and the high skilled jobs demands, that's where they tend to concentrate. And there are various outposts on these different measures, and we'll explore those in a bit more detail in a minute. But you can see that when we talk about levelling up and regional inequality, there is this very strong sort of London and its surrounding areas kind of dimension to it, which is that what economists talk about in terms of agglomeration effects, that essentially once you have a certain cluster of industries like the City of London and things like that in that area, and it's a place that's connected, London is very much a global city, that allows all these other industries to sort of cluster around it. And that's great, and it leads to a sort of a part of the UK which is kind of really plugged into the global economy, as a sort of real concentration of knowledge intensive jobs that go with it. But the challenge with levelling up is how you get the rest of the country to fully participate in that. And you can really see that sort of even on this map, that actually that sort of belt around London is quite different from much of the rest of the country.
It strikes me, Duncan, just looking at this, how the difference is marked even greater on the left-hand side, the map on the left-hand side, where there are darker and lighter ends of the scale, and that represents the labour, the talent availability, right? That's the location of workers with that high skill level, which is quite marked difference between the highest and lowest, as opposed to demand for jobs at that level. And as you say, it's a fairly general view, but we're starting in the general, digging deeper. But even then, there's quite a marked difference between the two, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we talked about last time as well, it's interesting as well because, of course, actually we've done well at increasing the share of adults with higher education, and a lot of those have gravitated towards where the jobs are, and you can sort of see that on the map. And so we've done better at adding highly educated people than we have at adding highly skilled jobs. And of course, that's another interesting question, but we'll keep it to one side for now, I guess.
Yes. So blending these two together, we then came up with something that looked like this last time. We were actually looking at older data last time, so this is a slightly more updated. But remind us what we're looking at here then.
Yeah, so we've taken those two metrics. So we've got education on the bottom axis, and then we've got the share of high school jobs on the vertical axis. And we've created 4 quadrants. This is a method that's kind of used by the OECD and a few others, where essentially what you say is the bottom left are those areas that have got below average share of working age people with higher education and a below average share of jobs in the high skill categories. So they're what we call a low skill equilibrium. They've got both low demand and low supply at the high skill end. And so it's kind of a relatively settled point. And as you can see, there's a very large number of places in that category, and that's kind of, you know, the levelling up challenge in a nutshell, because it's kind of like, how do you move these places where they've got low supply and low demand of high skills to be anything different? And then at the top right, you've got the opposite situation, and the sort of the really large bubble right at the top right is London. Which of course has the biggest concentration of high skilled jobs and the biggest share of highly educated people. And there's this kind of smattering of other places along the way there, and they're high skill equilibrium. They've got high supply and high demand, and that fits together. And then you've got a few places on either side of that. And so on the top left, you've got those areas that have got more high skilled jobs than average. And there's only 3 of these regions in England. But they've got fewer than average highly educated people. So there's a skills gap effectively. You've got, you know, at this very high level, there's a lot more jobs that you'd expect in highly skilled categories than there are people. And then on the bottom right, you've got the opposite situation where you've got a lot of educated people, but the actual number of jobs in high skilled categories is lower, in fact. And so, you know, they're either working in jobs that are, you know, below their skill level a lot of the time, or maybe they're having to commute to somewhere to go and take a job if they want to do that. And so it's kind of those are the areas where you would hope that businesses would come calling, but what we actually found last time was that a lot of these places have been in that category for a long time, and they've increased the share of educated people without necessarily seeing a follow-on increase in the demand for jobs of that kind.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned just the 3 skill gap areas, and yeah, before I hear everyone crying, but there's skills gaps everywhere. I think that's the reality, is there are skills gaps in a lot of places, but we're just looking at a very basic headline measure before we dive deeper. Of those 3, 2 of them are pretty much on that standard central line journey between low skill equilibrium and high skill, aren't they? So it's just that one real outlier, which is quite unique.
Yeah, absolutely, and we can come to where it is in a moment, because then it starts to make sense. But yeah, it's the main point, as you say there, is that most areas are on that kind of diagonal path from low skill to high skill equilibrium, and that makes sense because you'd expect labour markets to be broadly in alignment. I mean, you know, if a place is too far out in one direction or the other, then there are incentives for people to either move out or for businesses to move in or out, depending on what the situation is. And so that does make sense. And yeah, to your point about skills gaps, yeah, there are all kinds of skills gaps. And I can bore for England on that topic, as many others, in terms of the definition of them. But this is a very macro scale skills gap question. What we're saying here is that area that's up there has a lot more high skilled jobs than average. I mean, way above it. It's more than 50% of its jobs are in high skilled categories, and yet fewer than a third of its workforce are highly educated or above, and that makes it a real outlier compared to the rest of the country. And so if you assume, and we generally do, that high skilled jobs tend to require high levels of education, then that makes it look quite an interesting place to look at.
Yes. So are you going to put us out of our misery on our next?
It actually makes total sense when you think about it. You can see it at the top left there, and it's basically the Copeland area of Cumbria, which of course is where Sellafield and the nuclear industry has a huge cluster, and there's a few other engineering employers there as well. And it's quite interesting because that creates a very focused high-skilled job category, which is very engineering driven, and therefore doesn't align exactly. You know, most of the rest of the country's high-skilled jobs tend to be much more service driven, be that you know, business services or the health service or whatever, and sort of that part of Cumbria really stands out as being very sort of industrial in its high-skilled job demand, and that's why it does stand out. There are the other 2 kind of skills gap areas are interesting in their own right. One of them is South Nottinghamshire and Nottingham itself. And that's that little green island in the middle of England. And then right at the bottom, you might not be able to see it, there's a little green patch around Brighton as well, which is the other skills gap area. And so that's quite interesting because, of course, you'd expect there's a lot of educated people there, but actually there's more jobs than there are people relative to other places. Although, as we said earlier, for Nottingham and Brighton, these are sort of more marginal differences compared to the rest. But I think what's really interesting on this map is that sort of the dark blue patch from London heading off towards Cambridge, out into the Thames Valley. I think it probably covers Basingstoke by the look of it as well. You'll be delighted to hear down through Sussex as well. That's the kind of the sort of the agglomerated kind of global economy that we have around London. And you can see it's quite interesting that we often talk about the Greater South East, but it's not quite as simple as that, because you can see that the lighter blue shaded area is the low skill equilibrium area. And you can see it's fairly consistent across most of the country, but that also includes places like Essex and like Kent and parts of sort of Sussex, I guess, or Surrey maybe. That it's kind of, even though they are close to London and the southeast, and in that area, they're not really getting the same kind of high skill equilibrium. They're not part of that kind of knowledge intensive cluster in the same way as those sort of darker blue patches are. And then the yellow areas are interesting because they're the skill surplus areas. So they're the places where there are more highly educated people than average, but fewer high skilled jobs. And some of them make total sense. So you can see one sort of around Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire kind of way. I guess it's Buckinghamshire. And then another one in Wiltshire. And of course, they are sort of skill surplus, but they're also really adjacent to that kind of knowledge economy cluster. And so actually probably there's a fair number of those workers who just cross those borders and get jobs in that area. The more interesting ones are places like sort of the South Devon there, and that band across sort of Yorkshire and up into Cumbria, and that one across sort of Manchester and Liverpool. Where these are areas where there is this kind of large pool of workers who are highly educated, but there aren't really the jobs to go with it. And so this is quite interesting from a levelling up perspective, that actually there are places where there are skills, but they're not really getting the demands. It's quite interesting, the Yorkshire one, that there's one part of that area which looks sort of Leeds-ish from a quick look at the map, which it has high skill equilibrium, but then a big band around it where there's a surplus of workers. And some of those will probably be working in that kind of high skill equilibrium area, just as you get that in the southern areas, but only some. And the sort of the sheer range of those sort of skill surplus areas is quite interesting, because it suggests that there's actually sort of room to improve, but it hasn't happened so far. And as we were talking about last time that we were together, over the sort of the 10 years from 2010 to 2020, there is this kind of big expansion of degree educated workers, really moved quickly, and it's a great story in many ways, but it hasn't been followed in a consistent way by job demand coming through either.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And obviously, as you put the caveat on earlier, we're looking at a pretty macro, fairly simple way of defining it, but I think it does illuminate some interesting regional trends for sure. And of course, there are different ways you could visualize elements of different data, but we're probably going to come up with the same sorts of stories time and time again, aren't we, with even if we do dive into more granularity. And of course it will vary by industry setting, etc., but it does give us a good start point, really, I think, for wanting to get beneath the surface on this. And so that's where we're heading now, isn't it, Duncan? So we've been looking at high skilled supply and demand, in effect, to kind of model out local regional economies in this measure, but as we've talked about throughout, and you've caveated plenty, there's a lot more nuance to it than this. So having kind of built out these categories, this enables us to maybe look at what the differences are between those different equilibria, and see if we can then mine a level of detail beneath that actually gives us perhaps some further clues that we can, a bit more tangible and so what-ish, aren't they? So let's move on to the next thing, and perhaps you can explain this rather pretty chart.
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit of background on the data first, because as regular customers and audience members will be aware, we have lots and lots of skills data within MC Burning Glass, and so we often flash up lots of charts with skills data on that. And one of the things that we've been working on over the past few months is creating a hierarchy within them. So we have, I think, about 33,000 skill items in our skills library, so it's very extensive. Part of the problem with that sometimes is it's just too rich. It's, you know, you get a cacophony of skills coming through that are often very overlapping. And so what we've been trying to do is build a subcategory and category structure to really help to sort of, you know, summarize this. And so this is the top level of categories. There's about 31 of them, I think it is, and so they allow us to kind of just take a sort of a 10,000 feet view of what the skills information is. And so what we've done here is we've taken two of those geographic categories we talked about before, high skill equilibrium and low skill equilibrium. We've moved the skills gap and skill services to one side, partly because they're smaller groups, but also because, as you alluded to earlier, for the most part, they're just kind of slightly offbeat, you know, Copeland aside. And so what we've done with these 31 skills categories is that we've created a concentration metric. So it looks at the share of job postings in each of these geographies with this skills category versus the UK-wide picture. And we've ranked them in terms of the high skill equilibrium. And so unsurprisingly, you can sort of see that there are certain kinds of skills that are right at the top there. Things like property and real estate, economics, policy and social studies, performing arts and design, which are really way up there. Also in the mix are things like finance and media and writing and all these. And yeah, it's the kind of, you know, if you think about the kind of places that we have as high skill equilibrium, so London and the sort of the knowledge economy clusters around it, you know, it's things like technology and science and finance and, you know, knowledge intensive areas. And then at the other end where they're lower, it's things like manufacturing and production, transportation and logistics, engineering, and so on. And so, you know, it's kind of the sort of the high skill equilibrium areas generally tend to be very kind of knowledge intensive business services as their focus. And you see that coming through in this skills pattern. And you see the low skill equilibrium is to some extent, you know, not quite a mirror image, but is very different in a lot of these. And so it really starts to allow you to just unpick at this very high level again, you know, what the sort of the qualitative differences are, that it's not just that high skill equilibrium areas need higher skills. Well, that's fine, but what kinds of skills starts to get much more interesting. And we're doing this in two very broad geographies. As you know, if you compared Copeland with Sellafield to the City of London, you'd get really kind of different pictures, and that would be fascinating. And if you compared sort of the Thames Valley with kind of you know, one of our rural regions, for example, you get another set of difference. So the great thing about the skills categories is it allows us to really start to unpick these differences, but in a very kind of understandable way, because it's not just before when we had the detailed skills, we were just picking out what the top skills were, and they'd be very different between these areas, but that doesn't really tell you that much. Whereas here, it's allowing us to say, well, you know, across all of these kind of, you know, these skill categories here gives a real sense across the whole economy and the whole labour market. And so it really allows us to kind of get that kind of big picture view of what's different about these places. And so what we wanted to do as well is kind of start thinking about, well, this is the demand side picture, this is how it's different. And so there's a question then about how we respond to it, because I think thinking for levelling up is it's very easy to talk about how some places are rich and some places are poor. It's very important as well. But of course, what we want to do if we're really going to do levelling up is think about, well, how can we change that? What are the levers available to us? And so I think that's why it's worth kind of digging in and thinking about where we can start to sort of see how we respond through education is what we're going to come on to address that.
Yeah, fascinating, and lovely to share some hot off the press data that's coming to MC Burning Glass products shortly, but it's not there just yet. So something for you to get your teeth into in due course, but definitely a nice way of leveraging the power of the very granular skills data and trying to make it a bit more workable at a higher level as well. So that's exciting to share. So as you say, we've dug a bit deeper, and we've particularly focused in on the IT skill, which we've chosen because you can see quite a clear, it's clearly a kind of a high skill equilibrium driven skill set, and there's quite a marked difference between those two geographic clusters. So it does appear to be quite a significant differentiator to describe what's driving employer demand in high skill equilibrium areas, that might not be quite so the case in low skill equilibrium areas. So we've gone on then to start to unpick, so this is the demand side, but can we understand anything from looking at what the education system is outputting in this field, to see how supply and demand connect? So I think that's onto the next one here.
Yeah. So what we've done, over the past couple of years, what we've been working on within MC Bending Glass is kind of building out a sort of as complete a picture of education supply as we can, and we're sort of in the next stages of that now with higher education as well. But what that's allowed us to do here is build out a picture of achievements by each of these regions for different levels of education, including further education, higher education, and apprenticeships. And what's quite interesting is that you sort of see the level 1 to 2 qualifications. So these are entry level. You're not going to get many IT jobs with a level 1 to 2 qualification. But you can see that the sort of the mix there is really wide. You know, there's some places that have got hardly any provision, and some places that have got a lot, and there's no obvious pattern. And similarly with level 3-5, not quite as diverse, but similar in terms of the broad shape. But it's level 6 to 8, so this is degree and above, that you really see a pattern that is familiar from our previous charts, where you get that sort of that lighter shaded area around London and the southeast, and sort of another bit in the sort of the northwest as well, which kind of gives you a sense that it's a bit more aligned with what we know about the levelling up picture, and that's quite interesting, because it suggests that when people are picking what education qualifications to do in IT, at lower levels of education, it's not that responsive to the labour market, but at higher levels it seems to be. I should mention, by the way, that all these data are produced on a domicile basis, so it's about where learners live rather than where they learn. And so the pattern for degree and above reflect where students are actually coming from. They may be, you may be in London and have decided to do a computing degree in Sheffield, say, but you will be counted in London here.
Interesting. So so there's quite a variation in supply, and when we dig a bit deeper and certainly start to bring supply and demand together, we get quite an interesting pattern, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as I was saying, the map sort of suggested that there's a sort of a clearer connection between sort of the demand side pattern of knowledge intensive, highly performing economies at that sort of degree and above level. And we can see that here on the right hand chart, where so the bottom axis in each of these cases is the location quotient, so a measure of how concentrated demand is for job openings. And you can see that there's a much more of a clear kind of sort of up and to the right kind of picture on that right hand chart, which suggests that where demand is higher, take up of education qualifications around computing and IT are also stronger. Whereas if you look at the other two panels here, there's no such direction. In fact, if anything, on the left-hand panel with level 1 to 2 qualifications, you can see a much wider spread with some of the higher achievement levels actually in quite low demand areas. So it's quite interesting that you've got that kind of greater alignment with labour market demand at the top end than at the bottom end of the qualifications mix. And that's interesting, because it sort of suggests that at the bottom end, people are maybe being a bit more scattered in terms of what their kind of choices are, and a suggestion that maybe that's not always the best choice for them. But also maybe we're not building on that and sort of making those skills available further down the track as well. So there's quite a lot of ways to think about it. And I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, you kind of have to view demand and supply at the same time. You kind of have to think about, you could get some of those areas where young people are going and doing, and these are predominantly young people, lower level qualifications in IT, and you could encourage them to do it even more. But if you don't get businesses to come and create jobs that are going to use those skills, well, how's that going to help? So it's kind of, a real need to think about how you're developing the sort of the business economy as well as developing skills.
Well, certainly, and when we look at labour supply and demand, we do find ourselves falling into chicken and egg territory, don't we? In respect to, is it the fact that there's talent available that would attract businesses in to access that talent, or is it a case that we need the businesses there to drive the supply towards where it needs to be? And certainly from this example, and this is just one example, looking at IT, it probably is suggesting it's a little more certainly at the top end, the higher end of the skills, so those most proximate to the labour market in terms of education output. It may well be that the employer demand is quite a heavy influencer, and I suppose the difference perhaps when we look at these education levels is that level 6 to 8, it's a real student investment decision, right? There are loans being taken out and money in effect being parted in a way that funded education might not quite have such an acute connection, perhaps. Might be wrong, but that might be one of the trends, and this is just IT. We haven't done this for all of them. We wanted to just pick out an example, but it could be an interesting exercise to compare and contrast in due course different segments of that skill spectrum that we looked at earlier. But it does sort of start to hint towards how do you nurture the demand side, the employer demand side, and then make sure there are connections back to ensure the supply side can meet that demand. But it, as you say, they need to be looked at very much together and not as separate entities in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So fascinating examples. Not sure necessarily we've got the answers for leveling up here, but what we are hoping to do is continue to illuminate different facets of this discussion and think about the ways in which different data points, all of which we've got in our stable, can be pulled together and explored on a case by case basis. So hopefully it's inspiring some research ideas from those of you joining us. So Duncan, do you want to just quickly summarize, I think, what kind of the key takeaways are from your perspective from what we've looked at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first one there is that geography really does matter, and that we see that kind of agglomeration effect of London spilling out into the surrounding areas, and the sort of, when you actually map out the high skill equilibrium versus the low skill equilibrium, you really get a feeling of how much geography is a sort of a strongly determining factor. And so when we talk about leveling up, the danger is that it kind of leads you to think that everywhere should be measured on how much it looks like the highly productive areas of sort of London and the surrounding areas. But that's not really a fair comparison, because the sorts of the further out reaches of England, and the same would apply to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland too, are never going to be exactly like areas in the sort of London and the surrounding parts, because they benefit from that agglomeration effect where they're near to a global hub. And so actually thinking about that does have quite big implications for how you think about industry development, for example, that you can't just say, oh, well, we're going to recreate the City of London, or the the South Cambridgeshire sort of technology cluster. It's kind of, these sorts of really kind of high-end economic clusters are really difficult to recreate. And so actually thinking about how you can make progress towards higher performance in a way that fits your local capabilities really does matter. Economic geography is not something that we can easily change, and therefore we need to kind of move with the grain. Second one is that, as we see from that quite simple analysis of just comparing the high skill and the low skill equilibrium areas, that sort of knowledge intensive demand creates quite rich differences in skills demands. It's not just a matter of that they need high skills, it's that high skills take certain forms. And as we also saw with the sort of the Copeland example with Sellafield and so on, high skill demands can sometimes look quite different in different places. And I think partly the sort of the concentration of our high skill equilibrium areas around London and the southeast can sometimes blind us to how varied it can be. And so actually being able to unpick the sort of the content of skills demand is really valuable and important. And then that third one is, how do we align education with skills demand? And learners individually will always have their own aspirations within that. And they'll go with what they know in part, what they've been encouraged to do, but also if we can give people the information to make the right choice, then that's important. But also, and this has been a theme all the way through this discussion really, I think, is how you can think about the demand side alongside the supply side, that it's not simply a matter of, oh, if we make lots of students do this course, then we'll have lots of skills extra and that will allow us to attract businesses. Well, will it? We saw that there are areas that have got skills surpluses in our analysis here at the macro level. So it's entirely possible that you end up encouraging people to do courses that maybe they don't get jobs, or maybe they get jobs because they move elsewhere. And although in part, obviously people can be a bit more mobile with jobs since the pandemic because there's more home working, I think we're probably still a long way from most people, especially early career people, being able to abandon any sense of place. It's kind of, quite some way from that, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's some fascinating stuff. And when we reflect on the levelling up agenda, we've sort of highlighted before, the two strands to this, of course, easy to focus on those relatively lower performing areas and aspire to move towards the higher performing. And so, in the examples we brought through, how do we help regions consider that move towards, and we use that word carefully because it's not necessarily about replicating, as you just described, exactly what those high performing areas are, but how can we unlock opportunities to at least continue that charge towards the top right zone from within. But is the economic geography going to be intrinsically limiting in some areas relative to others? So that's just an interesting concept. But also within, I think hopefully we've dispelled the slight myth of London and the southeast as a big amorphous blob of success, when clearly there's quite significant variation even within that definition. So a lot of this is about really getting into the weeds of what's driving different localities, and even in our relatively successful, strong, productive, high skill equilibrium regions, there's still potential to continue to evolve and improve and therefore raise the bar right across the piece as well. So yeah, very interesting analysis. I hope you guys have found it useful to kind of see some of our thought processes and different ways in which we're trying to kind of illuminate what's just going on in different localities. But I think the critical factor, as you described, Duncan, is locality does really matter. Now, I know I've been in plenty of discussions where we talk about, well, what is the purpose of education? We're somewhat implying the purpose of education is to drive employment and business, which of course is one key strand of the drivers behind education, and particularly as we start to think about education as an investment at the higher skilled level. But I think that the geography piece still plays a role, because quite frankly, if we have talent aspirations that can't be met by our region, and we see this playing out, then the next question is, which regions do meet that opportunity, that potential for me? And at least having clarity on that is as valuable as knowing where the demands in your locality lie as well. So that real connection, I think, is critically important, and the continued democratization, quite frankly, of the knowledge of what's driving different economies and local economies is really critical to making sound, logical decisions right the way through your organizations down to the communities that you're serving. So thank you for your work in that realm. So just to conclude then, before I think we should have some time for a few questions if there are any. So I'm just priming you there, Debbie, to scan the questions in case there are any to share with us. But really just continue to want to illuminate these trends and ideas, because ultimately we want to help you think about how you can leverage data and insights like this, the sorts of data that we have within our tools and services, and to really showcase how you can continue to leverage that. So you've probably got a good sense today of the sorts of information that we're sitting on, that hopefully you as customers are sitting on. And if you're not a customer, we'd love to talk to you about how you can access this and really continue to ask those critical questions about, well, what really is driving jobs demand in your region, and how do you really start to break that down, as we started in this example, to break that down into more granular building blocks of what skills are they actually seeking to drive forward their business. Obviously, if we're in the realm of economy creation and thinking about how we might positively change that demand, then thinking about what sorts of skills are driving different sectors that you might want to nurture, particularly around the green economy and new opportunities there, then reality is this is available. This is work that's going on across the country. So if you don't have a lot of it in your area right now, certainly look to other regions where they do to get a sense of what might be needed to drive that forward. So it's as much about looking at other places as it is your own region. And then, as we saw with the IT example, how can we understand what skills are being outputted through the education system, as well as we start to think about where that supply pipeline is, and how we might use that to think about, do we need to realign that supply pipeline, or how do we better leverage it so that we can keep that talent that we're nurturing in our region within the region to drive that activity. So we have a range of data and tools, ranging from tools like the analyst research tool and a number of new services. And I think I mentioned last time, and you'll be seeing more of this in due course, trying to find different ways to deploy that information in more consumable dashboard solutions as well, so around particular topics and themes. And in fact, as we come on to talking about where we're going from here, that's certainly a topic we'll come into. So we continue the leveling up agenda through the next month or two. On the 24th of May, we have our sector leaders coming back together for a discussion, thinking about the role that local partnerships and the role in which local stakeholders can work together around using a common language of data to drive activity, and think about that connectivity between labour supply, labour demand, and levers we can pull on that as well. So that should be a fascinating discussion on the 24th of May. And then I believe, Duncan, you and I are back together to conclude this webinar series in June, where we'll be talking a little bit about the regional disparities and furthering our analysis to think about how we might leverage the data to build on the skills understanding, the work of local partnerships, to really think about leveraging data to drive real tangible action. So excited to share some thoughts on that, and you can sign up at the webinars page listed below. I mentioned the dashboards, and very pleased to say that we will be launching our local government focused economy insight dashboard very soon. In fact, I think Will has a webinar tomorrow. Yes, it's tomorrow, where he'll be launching that. So if you've not already signed up and you're interested to understand that a little bit more and think about how we might be able to gain insight into your locality and share that with key stakeholders, a wider group of key stakeholders, then be sure to sign up to that one. And then on Friday, we have Richard, who's our higher education university lead, going to be taking us up a level and thinking about the role that global data is playing, and with playing ever more a key role to help institutions position themselves within the global labour market as well as the UK labour market. So hopefully that'll be an interesting one to raise our focus a little bit. And then back to our friend Will, who will be continuing to showcase the new dashboards, and will be bringing a customer to share their experiences with that dashboard and wider work on shaping their local economy. And that'll be on Thursday, the 12th of May. So a little flurry of different webinars there hopefully can be helpful to your own thinking and understanding of the work that you're doing. So I'm going to bring this one to a close. Debbie, do we have any questions? We've got a few minutes that we can maybe cover off some questions. Are there any out there?
Yeah, that would be great. There's been quite a bit of interest in obviously how the data is reflected with home working. So there's one question here. Have you seen any significant shifts in the patterns since 2019? And the person is thinking about decentralization due to flexible, remote, hybrid working patterns. So I think.
So yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think the data about jobs is mainly driven by where the jobs actually are. The regions that we use here are sort of model on travel to work areas, so they reflect traditional commuting patterns. I don't think, I mean, there's not a lot of data to really sort of demonstrate either way on this. I don't think that there's a huge change as yet in the sort of the pattern of labour market demand. What is the case is that maybe fewer people are travelling to where they work. I also, because Britain's quite a small country in geographic terms, it's not like we've seen a huge kind of movement of population as apparently has happened in the US, for example, where you could maintain a job in San Francisco but go and live in Idaho, for example. That's not, I mean, I'm sure that has happened here, people moving to, say, the sort of the Lake District or something like that, but I don't think it's been sort of such a huge change that has happened. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that insofar as the remote working thing kind of has an effect, it pushes the commuting pattern effect that we've already been seeing over the past few decades anyway, a further distance along. And what I mean by that is that you get places, especially around London, in what we used to call the stockbroker belt, if you will, where you get towns which are effectively more and more sort of dormitory towns, where they're actually quite prosperous places. There's lots of people there with money, but they don't have much of their own industry, because people, well, before COVID, would get on a train Monday to Friday or in a car to go to where their job was. And so these places have quite nice economies in many ways, because they're quite prosperous places, but they're not very good for people who don't have one of those jobs that you commute to, or remote work as it probably is now. And it kind of, and so that creates interesting patterns. And so, we know the whole discussion about towns that's been going on over the past sort of 5 years or more is that increasingly we've got towns which are kind of, without a strong economic core, because a lot of them used to be based on factories and so on that have since passed by. And the sort of the remote working effect may actually sort of accelerate that process even further, and have its own effect even in, as I say, prosperous places, where before we think about the towns narrative in terms of towns that have been left behind in the cliche, we may get towns which aren't left behind. In fact, in many ways, on many measures, they'll look very successful places, but they're not always great if you're not, a kid that's going to go to university, say, because actually affording it to live there is quite hard, because the house prices are bid up by people wanting to live there, and the actual job opportunities extend to maybe being working in a supermarket, running a restaurant, or working in a gym, all perfectly good jobs, but often jobs without great career progression opportunities. And so I think it's too early to say sort of the longer term impact on changed work practices in terms of the distribution of jobs, although, as I say, I don't think it'll be quite as marked here as in some places, but I do think that the sort of the consequences will accelerate some trends that were already underway.
Yeah, and when we think back to the map with the skills surplus, the yellow skills surplus colouring, and you highlighted Wiltshire, you highlighted Buckinghamshire. I mean, these are areas that are close to major high skill urban centres that probably were forming that commuter community, that are now not necessarily commuting, but they're still working for companies that are based elsewhere. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's just, as you say, sort of a shifting of the commuting trend than anything there. So yeah, one to keep an eye on for sure. But it also potentially presents an opportunity where the talent resides, for businesses to think differently about their own location strategies, and maybe start to move out to where the talent is a little bit. So there could be opportunities to certainly use this moment to illuminate the fact that in a number of hinterland areas there is talent that could be leveraged on a more local basis, perhaps, than expecting them to return back to the old ways of commuting into the big cities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Just one other question, if you don't mind, guys.
Okay.
The current level 4 to level 6 offer is focused for the most part on large qualifications. Will greater flexibility in terms of the use of modules, etc., to support training like upskilling as part of lifelong learning and encapsulated by lifelong loan entitlement support, so will that support levelling up, do you think? Sorry, it's quite a long question.
Yeah, no, I think there's a really, personally, and Duncan, feel free to slap me down here, as you say, as you're very welcome to do. But I personally think that's got to be a big move. I think as we start to think about, in effect, we're sort of hinting at that by the analysis that we did, where we were looking at sort of, maybe the old way of defining localities based on, do they have plenty of graduates and are there lots of graduate jobs, as a kind of a definition of success. I think realistically we were using that to kind of get to a more nuanced and granular view that says, actually, ever more so, it's about, do people have the skills or the capabilities that we're seeking, and that creates a ton more flexibility and transferability. But what that does do is make it a lot more difficult to make the strong connection between the big qualifications and a career, as it used to be. And it's very much now kind of breaking it down into the bite-sized competency skills, a lot of talk about digital credentialing, etc. And that's a big driver to why we've created the skills language and the hierarchy in our data, is to enable that, but also to think about the flexibilities that can bring in helping individuals realize that they have capabilities that might be transferable and might line to different opportunities and career trajectories that is very difficult to predict at the outset of your education, for a 50, 60, 70-year career, and a world that's ever changing. So my sense is that we do need to be moving ever more to thinking about more flexible, modular, skills-based learning, as well, of course, as well as thinking about the holistic building a good citizen aspect of education, and those foundational human skills that need to be nurtured and evolved. But I think that there needs to be a way of leveraging flexibilities to enable individuals as well as regions to kind of adapt quickly to the changing environment, and in a way that aligns better with what business is seeking. Don't know if you have a particularly strong view, Duncan, on all of that.
Not massive. I think my question with all these things is whether there's a premium of getting a whole qualification, and whether, if you break it up, employers don't value it as much. And I think that's a challenge in education economics. There's a whole question about the screening hypothesis of education versus the human capital one, which is, do people use qualifications as a kind of, you managed to stay the course and go through it? I guess that's the question for me, because I think, to your point, I think there's certainly a case to say that, allowing people to tailor what kind of skills they're getting and communicate that offers obvious advantages. I wonder, in terms of the leveling up thing, whether it solves that problem or not. It may, at an individual level, make it more responsive if it's successful, but I don't know that leveling up. But
cool.
Thank you, gents. That's great. So over to you. Thank you very much, Andy.
Good stuff. Well, If that's us, thank you everyone for joining us. Appreciate it. Thanks for the questions there, and Debbie for sharing those. As Debbie mentioned, we will be circulating slides. If you have particular strong opinions on what we're talking about here, or ideas, thoughts, feel free to shoot them in, make a comment. We read all of the questions, etc. So if you feel particularly exercised on anything, do share that with us. It's helpful to make sure that what we're sharing and we're thinking about aligns the challenges that you're working through or ideas that you're looking to test. So do get in touch, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you very much.